February 1943, Northern Solomons. Rain drifted through the palm canopy, a steady hiss that drowned the jungle's breath. In a narrow ravine below a ridge, Japanese infantry crouched among roots and wet stone, confident they were unseen. American patrols had stopped firing hours ago. Silence meant safety. Then a single metallic thump split the stillness. A shell arced invisibly through the mist. It landed behind the ridge, exactly where safety had seemed certain. The explosion rolled through the valley like thunder, tearing the earth apart. Within seconds, more followed, spaced with mechanical precision, each strike finding the hidden line. Men who had vanished into the terrain now faced a weapon they couldn't see, couldn't outflank, and couldn't silence. The weapon that reached them wasn't new, it was perfected for moments just like this. The Pacific War in early 1943 had become a contest of patience, endurance, and terrain. After the brutal struggle for Guadalcanal, American commanders realized that Japan's greatest ally was not merely its soldiers' fanatic resolve, it was the jungle itself. Dense growth swallowed sightlines, ridges hid artillery, and every advance meant moving blind through dripping undergrowth. Japanese troops had mastered the art of concealment, digging spider holes and caves into volcanic slopes where even machine gun fire vanished harmlessly into the mud. Traditional infantry weapons proved clumsy in this green labyrinth. Rifles and grenades were effective only within yards. Artillery batteries, positioned miles behind the line, often fired blind or risked hitting their own men. The U.S. Army needed a weapon that could bridge that deadly gap, something light enough to carry through swamp and hill, yet powerful enough to reach an unseen enemy behind the next rise. That answer came from a steel tube little more than 2 feet long. The .60 mortar, later refined into the M1 and M2 series, offered precision where the jungle denied vision. It could be fired from a kneeling position, adjusted in seconds, and dropped rounds within yards of target coordinates called out by men pinned to the ground. In a war where every ridge became a fortress, this simple, hand-carried weapon would redefine what infantry support meant. Its story began long before the Solomons, in the workshops of American engineers who studied trench war relics and transformed them for a faster, more mobile kind of war. The M1 mortar's origins traced back to lessons learned from the First World War, when French and British forces had first used simple tube launchers to lob explosives over trenches. American designers took that crude concept and turned it into something far more efficient, a lightweight, precision-built weapon that could travel with the infantry instead of waiting behind it. By 1942, the M160 mortar weighed just over 40 pounds. A 2-man crew could assemble it in under a minute. One man carried the baseplate and bipod, the other the smoothbore tube and ammunition. Within moments, they could drop high-explosive rounds on targets half a mile away, and with experienced hands far beyond that. In the Pacific, that portability became the difference between progress and paralysis. While artillery required cleared zones and radio spotting, mortar crews operated in the mud, side by side with riflemen. They fired from behind tree trunks, from shell holes, even from foxholes barely large enough to stand in. The weapon's range curve allowed shells to drop almost vertically, bypassing ridges and jungle cover where Japanese defenses thought themselves untouchable. Japanese commanders at first dismissed the mortar as an infantry toy. They soon learned otherwise. Within months of the weapon's arrival in the Solomons, entire platoons were erased from positions that had survived naval bombardment. The Americans had found a way to bring artillery's power into the hands of men crawling through vines and rain. Behind every calm ridge and every quiet jungle hollow, the silence was now deceptive, because somewhere beyond the mist, a mortar crew was already dialing their next coordinates. For the American infantryman, the mortar wasn't a weapon of glory, it was a burden of precision. Each tube, bipod, and baseplate added weight to a march that already crushed men under humidity and exhaustion. Yet every soldier in a mortar team understood their importance. The riflemen might advance and retreat, but the mortar crews were the invisible backbone of every assault. Operating the M1 demanded teamwork that bordered on instinct. One man calculated angles and elevation by feel, another measured range through shouted coordinates or hastily scribbled sketches in wet notebooks. The ammunition bearer, often the youngest, fed the weapon under fire, counting seconds between shells to keep the rhythm unbroken. Every detonation was the product of quiet calculation. The jungle rarely allowed perfect conditions. Sometimes the base plate sank into mud, shifting aim by inches that meant life or death. Sometimes rainwater hissed inside the tube. Mortar crews learned to compensate. They fired blind, guided by sound, by smoke, by the cries of advancing units ahead. "Walk the fire!" the order often came. Step the explosions forward one ridge at a time. In battles like New Georgia and Bougainville, mortar teams became the true artillery of the Pacific. Their arcs of fire stitched through fog and forest, covering movements no heavy gun could reach. The weapon's song, that short, metallic thunk followed by the distant crash, became both comfort and terror. For American infantry, it was protection. For the Japanese hidden beyond the next ridge, it was the sound of inevitability. Each successful volley tightened the pattern of American warfare, mobility, precision, and adaptability replacing brute force. The M1 didn't just destroy, it shaped the tempo of every advance. To the Japanese defenders, the American mortar was an enigma, invisible, unpredictable, and deeply demoralizing. Their entire tactical doctrine relied on terrain advantage. Use the jungle's ridges to absorb line-of-sight weapons, then ambush from cover. But the M1 mortar shattered that equation. It didn't need sight, it only needed sound, a coordinate, and gravity. At first, Japanese officers dismissed it as short-ranged harassment fire, assuming the arcs were random. But at Guadalcanal, they saw how wrong they were. Mortar rounds struck with surgical rhythm, 1, 2, 3, walking up the slope exactly where troops took shelter. Entire cave complexes, thought safe from direct fire, collapsed under relentless plunging shells. The toy weapon had become an artillery substitute that moved with terrifying speed. The M1's engineering was deceptively simple. A smooth steel tube set at 45 to 85 degrees, a bipod with fine adjustment screws, and a base plate that spread recoil into the ground. The operator dropped a round tail first, where its primer struck a fixed firing pin at the base. No trigger, no moving parts, just gravity, chemistry, and precision geometry. Crews could fire up to 18 rounds per minute, adjusting each shot by mere degrees. In skilled hands, the M1 could drop a shell through a window 600 yards away. American troops quickly learned to coordinate multiple tubes for overlapping fire. While one team suppressed, another bracketed enemy movement. The Japanese, still operating under rigid command structures, could not adapt fast enough. By the time they triangulated a mortar's position, the team had already packed up and moved 50 yards deeper into the jungle. It was the perfect weapon for a war of motion and concealment, portable enough to vanish, powerful enough to erase entire ridgelines. And soon it would prove that power on one of the bloodiest ridges in the Pacific. November 1943, Bougainville. American Marines advanced toward a jungle ridge locals called Hell's Pocket, a natural horseshoe of volcanic rock that funneled attackers into kill zones. Japanese defenders had turned it into a fortress, camouflaged bunkers, interlocking machine guns, and deep trenches that disappeared under layers of vines. Repeated assaults failed. Every approach up the slope ended in the same brutal pattern: ambush, crossfire, silence. By dawn of the third day, the air stank of cordite and rotting foliage. The rain hadn't stopped in 40 hours. Riflemen lay pinned behind logs as Japanese Type 92 machine guns cut through the undergrowth. The terrain made direct fire impossible, no clear targets, no visibility beyond 20 yards. Commanders' new artillery was useless here. They called for the mortars. 6 M1 tubes were hauled forward under fire, set up on a patch of clay barely wide enough for their base plates. The crews worked wordlessly, using compass bearings and shouted distances relayed by scouts crawling halfway up the ridge. Within minutes, the first shell left the tube, its arc unseen, only the thump and the anticipation. Seconds later, the ridge erupted. The first barrage hit low, explosions tearing through the lower tree line. The next correction lifted the pattern uphill. Each shot walked closer to the Japanese bunkers, each detonation peeling away another layer of jungle. Trees toppled. Bunkers caved. For the first time, American infantry could see smoke rising from the ridge that had seemed untouchable. Observers reported the scene as controlled chaos. Mortar teams fired at maximum rate, adjusting elevation by inches, their rounds finding crevices artillery couldn't reach. The ridge that had halted two companies was now burning under a storm of steel that came from nowhere. And the Japanese defenders, who had built their confidence on terrain, suddenly realized the ridge was no longer protection. As the morning deepened, smoke rolled off the ridge in gray sheets. The rain turned it into steam. American officers watched through binoculars as the line of explosions climbed higher, each one landing with uncanny precision. Japanese observers tried to signal corrections to their own gunners, but the mortar fire came too fast, relentless, rhythmic, and untraceable. Within 30 minutes, the entire defensive ridge was under bombardment. Caves collapsed, bunkers disintegrated, and ammunition dumps ignited like brief suns beneath the canopy. The Japanese positions, once invisible, betrayed themselves in bursts of orange and black. Machine gun fire sputtered, then ceased altogether. Mortar crews didn't stop. Their tubes glowed faintly red from heat. Men worked with burned gloves, sweat mixing with rainwater, their faces streaked with clay and powder residue. The forward observers relayed calm coordinates through static. Shift 50 yards east, increase elevation 2 degrees. Each adjustment translated instantly into impact. For the soldiers pinned below, it was the first breath of relief in days. The ridge that had swallowed their comrades now trembled under their feet. When the firing finally paused, the jungle was silent. Only the slow crack of collapsing timber and the echo of delayed detonations from unexploded caches. At noon, infantry squads advanced cautiously up the slope. They expected resistance. Instead, they found wrecked trenches, shattered helmets, and the eerie stillness of positions destroyed without a single visible target ever seen. Captured survivors later described the experience with disbelief. They had thought themselves untouchable, hidden from view and protected by rock. "The shells came from the sky," one wrote, "without sound until impact. We could not shoot back. We could not even see where death was coming from." That day at Bougainville, the M1 mortar turned the impossible ridge into open ground and changed how both armies understood cover forever. When reports reached divisional headquarters that afternoon, officers could scarcely believe the numbers. A position estimated to hold 2 full Japanese companies had been neutralized in under an hour, without tanks, without artillery, and with minimal American losses. Engineers later counted over 100 collapsed fortifications along a single ridgeline. The after-action summaries were clinical, but the men who fought there spoke differently. They called it the ridge that disappeared. For the first time, infantrymen realized that the M1 mortar wasn't just support fire, it was transformation. The weapon had erased the boundary between line soldier and artilleryman. In the following weeks, U.S. commanders began assigning dedicated mortar platoons to nearly every combat company. Training manuals were rewritten overnight. Even skeptical officers admitted the results. In close terrain, a single well-trained mortar team could achieve what a battery of howitzers could not. The Japanese survivors withdrew inland, abandoning defensive ridges that once gave them complete dominance. In captured diaries, American interpreters found repeated references to the unseen thunder. It became clear that the mortar had done more than destroy. It had broken the psychological spine of concealment warfare. From that day, every ridge in the Pacific looked different to the men defending it. In the months that followed, the lessons of Bougainville spread across the Pacific like wildfire. At Saipan, Tinian, and later Okinawa, mortar crews became the silent vanguard of every assault. They advanced with the riflemen, not behind them, carrying tubes, shells, and the knowledge that their firepower could reach anywhere. The 60 M1 became so ubiquitous that Japanese intelligence reports began labeling it the ghost gun, a weapon impossible to anticipate, impossible to hide from. The numbers told their own story. By 1945, the U.S. Army had produced over 50,000 of these mortars and millions of rounds. They were cheap, rugged, and deadly accurate. American units developed a new rhythm of attack, coordinated arcs of fire that forced defenders to move even before the infantry arrived. The Japanese response was too late. Their trenches and caves, once the cornerstone of defense, had become traps. For the men who carried the M1, the satisfaction wasn't in destruction, but precision. Each successful hit meant one less ambush, one less friend lost to an unseen gun. And for the Japanese soldiers who once laughed at American toys, the jungle itself had turned traitor, revealing them to a weapon that didn't need sight to find them. In every war, a few weapons define how men fight and how they survive. The M1 mortar never earned the fame of a rifle or a tank, yet it shaped victory in places where visibility ended and instinct began. It was the voice of mathematics in the chaos of the jungle, a weapon guided not by sight, but by trust between soldiers who measured distance through courage and sound. For the Japanese, it was a revelation too late understood. No ridge, no cave, no concealment could withstand precision born from discipline. The mortar turned terrain into an ally instead of an obstacle, and in doing so, gave infantrymen the reach of artillery in the palm of their hands. When historians speak of the Pacific War, they remember the thunder of naval guns and the roar of bombers. But among the trees, it was often a quiet thump that changed everything, one shell at a time, arcing unseen through rain and fog, finding men who thought themselves safe. The ridge at Bougainville still bears the scars of that lesson, proof that in modern war, the smallest weapon can cast the longest shadow.